Hey, Dr. Brett. I think I'm getting offended by people taking offense. This reaction to seeing the pervasiveness of politics in spaces that, quote, have never been political before, and suddenly everything is politics, or whatever the way that they're phrasing it is. And I find this to be really interesting because I have studied political science. I like politics. I live in the nation's capital. Not necessarily all connected, but I would consider myself to be a fairly politically engaged person. And I'm finding it a little offensive at how offended people seem to be that suddenly places they thought were politically neutral suddenly magically are political. And so I think it's time we have a conversation about the taboo topic of dinner conversation, the thing that wasn't here before, but suddenly is the magic P word, politics. This is the Doc to Doc podcast.
It's voice notes turned podcast. Place as perspective.
Welcome back to the Doc to Doc podcast. I'm Nicole, reporting from my normal spot back in Washington, D.C. No more pod on the road.
And hey, everybody. I'm Brett, coming to you from Southern California. Had a little bit of a heat wave this weekend, and now we're back to lovely upper 60s, lower 70s. Can't complain.
That sounds nice. That sounds really nice. Yeah, I can't complain either. We've got a little burst of spring here in the district. I suppose I can complain about other stuff. The state of the world is weird, but that's just life, I guess, now, based off of like what we talked about last week on millennial angst. I guess this is just the tide that keeps coming in.
And if nothing else, we can find a little bit of joy and relief in the temperature, which I think is maybe why that's become a little bit of a running motif in season 2 so far. Is recognizing, at least if we step outside, it's pleasant to be there.
I was thinking that it either meant that we were basic bitches or we were doing something similar to Operation like Enigma, where they decoded the Germans' spy network by relying on weather reports. So maybe it was something more, I don't know, historically cool. But I like it that that's what our sanity is in the weather. And so, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, for our listeners, just want to remind everyone, we are encouraging folks this season, if you are enjoying the podcast, which again, you always tell us you do privately, we would love for you to make a public declaration of your love and support for us. Please love bomb others with your love for us by sharing the pod. If you have enjoyed a particular episode or a note on an episode or even a segment, we would love for you to share it with somebody. So for those of you who are with us, and we know you are, please share that pod. And as always, as Brett would say,
smash that like and subscribe button.
Please do. We always appreciate it.
It has been interesting when I have conversations with folks and they say, I really would love for this to be a topic. I want to hear what you and Dr. Nicole have to say about, and then they give me some different topics. And once or twice I've been like, I don't know if I have an opinion on that, or I don't know if I have the credentials or knowledge to sort of speak on it, but I'm flattered nonetheless that you want to hear us talk about things that feel important to you.
Yeah, 1000%.
So let's jump right into things. Dr. Nicole, we've been stewing in our millennial angst. A lot of that, as we talked about last week, comes from incessant, the news cycle, current events, groundbreaking events, once in a century natural disasters, which reminds me, one of the pieces of the timeline that I forgot to mention and was pretty embarrassed with myself when I was re-listening to the episode was when we're looking at the Bush years, talking about Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah.
Not only that being a moment where climate disaster became real in a new way in the conversation around climate, definitely changed, but also the racialization of the climate crisis was such a pivotal turning point, I think, in our culture, which in some ways I think is going to lead us right into our conversation today. And Would love to just hear more about what inspired your voice note and some of what you've been thinking about coming off of our last episode.
No, I appreciate that invitation. I know we said that like last week's episode was now that's what I call millennial angst. But it also strikes me that what we really could have done as millennials is we could have leaned into the fact that all of these events that have happened, both domestically and international, is I think more of the equivalent of a kids bop. And I think they're on like
Mm,
Bop 500 at this point. So we could just keep adding new records. But on top of that, yeah, the voice note that I sent is honestly inspired by a couple of people who I'm not going to name on the pod, but I have had some sidebars with other folks about politics. And I think
mm,
it's kind of interesting because I think most people that know me know that I tend to be a pretty publicly political person. One of the best I think one of the best examples is probably now this podcast for people who have
mm.
hours upon hours of listening to my takes on things as well as yours.
We are not subtle on this
Definitely
podcast.
not. No, I don't think subtle. Actually, I'm happy that we're not. But my research agenda, which is published and is open, I work for a public institution, so you can see what campaigns I've given money to. I mean, like, I lead a life that I would say is pretty actively political, but I'm really interested that folks have started talking and engaging who are not typically political with me or not in politics. Like, I
Mm,
live in DC. It doesn't mean that all of my friends are in politics. In fact, I'm actually pretty happy most of them aren't. But aside from this sort of rare group of people where we've always had this thread, it's really interesting to me that this has come up more and more with a couple of people that I suppose, for a lack of better terminology, I would call them apolitical in
uh,
how our discussions were framed previously. And something that has come up is thinking about in a second Trump administration, this hyper focus on politics and that everything that the sun touches, the Trump sun or Trump Cheeto sun, I don't know, and he's very
yes.
orange, right? So there's a metaphor there, but everything that is touched that is both something we would recognize as being political, the actual policies, executive orders, things that is part of so-called politics is political. But
Mhm.
then other things, whether it's a social event or something on social media, art, music, sports, all these other realms are now also touched by this. And it's inescapable in a way that people generally seem pretty pissed about. And so when I'm talking to people, and why I sent this pod was that it's such an interesting contrast to when, for example, even a few years ago under the Biden administration, I didn't feel that I was engaging in broad stroke conversations about politics with people, or it just didn't feel like a topic that was coming up. If
Mm,
anything, and you and I have described this to one another, I had personally felt like I could kind of just take a breather for a minute. Like I didn't have
yeah.
to turn on NPR every single morning, or I didn't have to look at world news every single day in order to feel like I was in touch with reality. Versus under Trump 1, and especially in Trump 2, I can do that. I feel that necessity. But on top of that, there is also a social media apparatus that makes it inescapable to have those conversations because of all of the ways that things are being politicized. And I'd
Mhm.
like to talk to you about that because I think you and I both have a particular politic, and also because of your training and my training academically, I think about things differently than suddenly things are politicized. But that seems to be the vibe with the people that are finally reaching out and saying, let's talk about this because Nicole, we know you have opinions.
Yeah, it's such an interesting conversation. I think there are a bunch of different directions we're going to go in this episode. As I was writing some of my notes to gather my thoughts, one of the comments that I wrote down was, "Is this going to be our capitalism episode?" Because I think it will keep coming up. Um, and I don't think it exactly will be our capitalism
Hmm.
episode. But one of the things that I was thinking about this morning in kind of prepping for this discussion is trying to define political.
Hmm.
Like when we say everything is political, or thinking about the critique of identity politics, or, when folks on the right often are saying, well, why is everything about politics? Or
Yeah.
trying to think like, well, what is my definition of political? Because we're not necessarily just talking about what is within the realm of politics and thinking about the president, Congress, legislature, laws, politics are much more foundational than that. And the definition that I kind of came to, and I'm curious how this resonates with you or what is coming
Hmm.
up when I pose that question, is I think what I mean when I think about everything is political is that we're talking about lives and livelihoods, and
Hmm.
that things that often folks want to say are not impactful or influential is that we are talking about the effect on people's lives. And that when we say everything is political, it's because we may not want to see how it impacts people's lives because somehow their lives are disconnected from ours. And I think, again, like capitalism is going to underlie a lot of this conversation. And this is not inherently meant to be a critique of people, but it is critical of viewpoints. Another underlying concept that I think we're going to keep coming back to is that of privilege.
Hmm.
And what is the privilege to be detached or to not
Yeah.
see how things impact lives and livelihoods if it doesn't impact yours?
I would co-sign on that definition. I think the formal definition, to bring in my precocious academic perspective, as somebody who has 2 degrees in political science, you're kind of taught from day one politics, or the understanding of politics is Aristotle would call it the understanding communities, understanding social systems. Politics are how people negotiate, how they interact with each other, and under that as a current of power. And I think people hear power and they assume that it is nefarious or it's poorly situated. But power can be, Foucault would describe it as a chain. Power is something that's interlinked and it doesn't always have an agenda. So in political science, when we said we were studying political science, if I wanted to be a smartass to people, I would say, oh, well, it's the study of power, right? And then by extension, government or governance. I think a lot of people get stuck on the governance part and they
Hmm.
don't think about the other part, which is communities or social systems, or how you described it, which is really understanding dynamics of how people are negotiating space with one another. And so when I added my geography hat into that realm of academic degrees, I now would look at politics and think politics is everywhere. Politics is how we negotiate space, how we understand power in space. And absolutely that essential question at the end of sort of who is privileged and who is not, who is visible, who is not, what are we talking about? What are we assuming? What are we not talking about? I think all of that is a negotiation that very naturally happens when people get together. So anytime
Mm.
two individuals are in a room or in a space, that is political. It
Hmm.
might not be political in the sense that we're taught of in the US of the 3 branches of government and blah, 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 blah. It's not like we're all running for office, but there is a negotiation. Another way I think to think about it is politics. Often it's a cliche, but politics is a dance, and it's being in potential lockstep or out of step with others, and that sometimes is also attributed to negotiations on how to get what you want from people, but dancing with one another, being in a space with one another, learning how we move together, how we don't, what we sacrifice, when we give a little bit more, when we take less. That is all politics. It's how we interact in communities. And then when you layer on the power aspect of that, and
Mm.
that is taken advantage of, that's where it, for me as like a social scientist, that's a really fun, exciting thing to start thinking about. But then going back to your point, which I think is really what I want to think about in this discussion today of who is not there, who's left out, and also the privilege that that one assumes when you think that that negotiation is neutral.
Uh-huh.
That's where I think, to bring this back to where I started, where it becomes interesting to me, is that people are now suddenly having hyper visibility on imposed politics by politicians. But underneath that has always been politics, whether or not that was in pursuit of power for bad reasons, or we go to a party and we decide, oh, we're watching a film. And what film we're watching, I don't know. And then you, myself, and 5 other people are negotiating what we watch. That's also political. It doesn't necessarily have the same stakes
Mm.
necessarily, but we're trying to convince each other. We're trying to negotiate amongst one another to have an outcome. And if we intentionally tried to sabotage your choice or something for a particular reason, then I think that's usually what people associate with more of the politics in government or governance, but it's also a political strategy. So there's a lot of layers to it. But like I said, I like to think about it as we're all dancing with one another. But the study of communities and the focus on power is something that
Mhm.
I would situate in our chat today as kind of the lens that I'm going to be looking at things, and also how I've responded to other people that have started to bring this up and saying, "Hey, I'm paying attention. What are your thoughts?"
And I think that the issue of visibility that you bring up is pretty fundamental to this conversation. Some of it being that folks who've been situated in power structures with some degree of privilege, there are things that have not had to be visible.
Hmm.
And things become political for folks when it becomes impactful.
Yeah.
And thinking about political struggles, power struggles are often about when the invisible is being forced into visibility. In both of our interest areas in research, a lot of critical race theory is
Hmm.
about revealing the unspoken about racial dynamics, or even some of the like early foundational concepts, or even naming whiteness as a racialized identity, where often race was being used synonymous to mean folks of color, only
Yeah.
speaking to certain identities. The normative power gets erased from that conversation. Similarly, for a long time, gender meant women, where it wasn't talking about the dominant power structure of men and masculinities. And you're framing it from a political science background where
Hmm.
politics are about how we are negotiating space, access, resources, and power. I think, yeah, that is going to be one of our underlying concepts throughout this conversation.
So, two examples that have been really helpful for me in the past of thinking about this lens of seeing politics everywhere actually happened while I was in grad school. And one was in a class that was not a political science class, but it was a guest lecture by a political scientist.
Hmm.
And I thought it was really interesting because the class was specifically set up that everyone came from a different disciplinary background. That's also part of the program that I was in. And
Hmm.
the lecturer wanted to talk about seeing political science as what Aristotle talked about, which was communities and understanding the social more than anything. And so they asked us to go around one at a time and say where you could locate politics. And no answer could be repeated. It was kind of like one of those, like, I have a basket and then I add apples and then I add this, right? And so you have to, whatever those like fun car games are. And by the third or fourth person, we had only talked about government, local, state, and it was
Hmm.
getting really into the weeds like county, municipal. And it just kind
No,
of kept going into that until finally someone said, oh, well, you can locate politics in the bathroom. Shout out to Stud
we
Architectures of
love
Masculinity.
talking about politics in the men's bathroom.
But you could find politics in a faculty meeting. You could find politics in a negotiation with your boss for a salary raise or something.
Mm.
You could ask, if politics could be at the local daycare center with you and the other parents and the toddlers, or trying to get into a school. Politics could be the negotiation to get your kid into the right charter school or something. So I thought that that was really interesting because it was so narrowly focused. And then opening that conversation, the floodgates were open that we could continue to go through. And we did multiple rounds of understanding that the political is social. And then the second
Mm.
thing, bringing in the geography lens, there's an example that I think a lot of folks have seen now in different television shows or movies, but I think it's also really helpful to carry this point home, which is the way that we understand space and geography, or the way that we design things as being political. And that relates to the Mercator Project. So, the Mercator Project is the maps that we typically look at when we see an atlas, when we see a
Mm.
globe. Most of us in the West have looked at a map and have seen, oh, wow, like Europe is really large, Greenland is massive, and
Hmm.
then Africa and other countries are not only not centered, so your eye has to look elsewhere for them, but they are small. And this is serves a purpose. It served a purpose for shipping lanes. It was used as a map that we've adopted for very kind of practical reasons. But on top of that, if you actually look at the size of continents and you shift the perspective to what they actually are size wise, you'll see that Africa is massive and Greenland is super small. And so it's a distorted picture of what we look at every day. But the consequences of that are really impactful. Because if you think, oh, well, someone wasn't being nefarious, this is for the purpose of shipping lanes, that can be true. But the other reality of that is when you stare at that kind of map for a long time and you're not critically engaging it, or you haven't seen an alternative map that would show you the actual scale and size of countries, what it does is it privileges perspectives that are centered. Or similarly, I think there's now a revitalization of the way that we talk about the Middle East as the quote Middle East. And the reason why the Middle East is called that is because it was east of England. And at the time when England was the largest empire in the world, maps were being constructed as there were more sort of folks going out and doing these mapping projects. And it required that the center of the world would be England and everything else would come from that. So Middle East to England, when you actually look at a map, it's not in the middle of anything. It might be east of India. It might be east of certain Asian or South Asian countries, but it's intentionally designed to focus on a particular set of perspectives at the expense of others is also a lens to look at it. In addition to, yeah, it's a map. It shows us where things are, but who creates the maps? What is the story it tells? And then to your point, critically, whose story is it not telling? And how is it forefronting certain perspectives over others in order to service questions of power?
And it makes me think the map conversation, the scene from The West Wing.
Yeah,
Remember
yeah.
this one? Where
Yeah,
it
it
was
was
the
they
big
talked
block
about
of
it.
cheese day, and CJ is meeting with these radical cartographers who want to redo the globe and the maps to
Yeah.
where I think they not only scale it differently, but they might also flip it so that
Yeah,
the
yeah.
global south is now the global north. And this is, I think, a really illustrative example because it's something where folks very easily can say, well, there isn't anything political about how things are drawn, or there was no intention or no ill will in it. But even as you're saying, culturally, at least in the West, I'm not sure if this is universal, but we valorize things that are on the top of a hierarchy. And so whatever is in global north, we see
Hmm.
that as being above countries and continents in the South and view that as being better because that is
Right.
how we orient priority. You put things on top, whether it's a pyramid, whether it's we
Hmm.
talked about the Olympics, the gold winner not only is centered, but also positioned higher
Elevated.
physically on the podiums. So I think it is a fantastic example. I will talk a little bit throughout the pod about some of my experiences with Occupy Wall Street and how I came into sometimes conflict with folks from other parts of my life who didn't understand this huge shift that I was making towards embedding a political foundation in everything because I think I've talked about matrix moments on the pod before where I felt like I had woken up and I could
Mm.
no longer see things as not being political or not being consequential or not being about power. But I remember one of my activist and facilitation mentors is a woman named Lisa Fithian. And I'll put some of her work in the show notes. Longtime activist. She came up in the is particularly an anti-nuclear weapon movement. She was probably on the ground in like Seattle 99. A lot of the very direct action oriented protest against globalization, G8 and things like that. But she trained many of us in facilitation skills. That was my first focus with Occupy Wall Street was helping to facilitate our large scale community meetings. And whether it was a giant general assembly or a small working group meeting, one of the things that she always encouraged us to ask and pose to the folks that we were helping to facilitate the conversation was exactly what you just said of who's not in the room and what
Right.
does it mean that they're not here? Who is not in the room and how are they impacted by the decisions that we're making today? And how might this conversation look different if the makeup of the participants was different?
Hmm.
And that is often not a question that we are encouraged to consider because power is often invested in that conversation being among homogenous folks and folks
Yeah.
of dominant power.
I would also highlight two folks that I think did this really well in geography is one, I think I cite this person in everything I've ever written, but they're a rock star, is Catherine McKittrick, who's a Black feminist geographer. And she writes about uneven geographies. She writes about Black feminist geographies. And something that she writes is this idea that the traditional geography, which is really formatted and formulated as a discipline under British rule, and there are societies, I'm part of them, the Royal Geographic Society, which still exists today,
So
shout out.
posh.
I know, so posh. But a lot of the societies, and someone's going to come at me for this, but a lot of the societies tend to be the Royal something
Mm,
society, just because patrons of science were typically the nobility or the king. Talking about how what we understand nowadays as geography as a formal discipline in a lot of the academies tends to come from this Western version of traditional geography. And when we talk about traditional geography, really what we're speaking to is Western European norms of geography.
mhm.
And who's intentionally left out of that because it is in service of a colonial empire project are folks of color. It's typically women, it's Black folks, it's the labor that often was seen as being in the colonies or elsewhere. That wasn't present. And so the ungeographic subject, the person or the thing that's often categorized, the person who's categorized as thing, is her focus in some of her earlier work of really trying to say, what if we focus on this subject for the first time? Because the tools that we have, the maps that we have, were explicit in their intention not to name these people, not to give them a platform to be seen. And that was a very political project by the intent of the people in power. And then the second thing I would add to that is the work of Lewis Gordon, who often frames this as shifting the geography of reason. So we're
Mm,
actually making a shift intentionally of how we think, which is to some of the methods that they use relates to this term called creolization, which is a big fancy multisyllabic word. But essentially what we're doing is what you're saying, Brett, is we're trying to shift the geography to spotlight something that has politically, intentionally for a long time not been given focus. So we think about
mhm,
global north versus global south. Would we even use those terms? We don't use third world versus first world anymore. And that's not just because it's not politically correct or it's not PC, but it's actually not accurate in its description. But even global north versus global south presumes that you're starting from one place as the center, as I talked about before. If the Middle East is east of England, the global north is north to what? But if
mhm,
it's a sphere, what if we shifted the geography of reason to say, let's start by looking at, and their work is often in the Americas, let's start in the Caribbean. We don't have to assume that the US is the only America. We can look at the others and shift that geography of reason from a different vantage point. And that also, by shifting that perspective, allows us to see things through the people or the places that are not often privileged in conversation. So I'll link these in the show notes. There's a bunch of them, and I could go on and on and on because this is my bread and butter as a scholar. But from there, I think also becomes this. You talked about kind of that matrix moment of like, once I see it, I can't unsee it. I feel the same way. And that is when I keep talking about this lens, it's like this haunting. It's almost impossible to look at anything and not see it through a lens of politics. I look at spaces and places differently. I look at social interactions or even cultural artifacts differently, of thinking about what is this trying to say? Like if it's speaking to us, what is it reaffirming?
mhm,
Who is it denying? Is this language good or bad? Not because I'm trying to tone police folks, but also by privileging certain perspectives, what is the potential political project behind that? Which is why I brought up the Middle East thing, because I think it's a really, people could see this as another we're trying to overreact and cancel people moment. But I think it's a really interesting topic of conversation that's happening right now, which is not new by any stretch of the imagination. But the other part of today's conversation, which is like the platforms of how we're seeing things as political, the platform, the algorithm has advanced this, at least in the way that I'm seeing this, such that I'm like, oh, this is something that needs reevaluation in the way that we talk about this area of the world. And I think that that is usually like an exciting opportunity, but we also have talked about how like a lot of people are frustrated by this. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about those frustrations, how I see them with friends
mhm.
and colleagues, but also trying to find the balance of engaging people, but also trying to understand why they might not see something as political or why that makes them uncomfortable when suddenly they have maybe that matrix moment or something and they're like, I don't, going to try to take whichever pill gets me back to the
Yeah.
other side.
And you mentioned a couple of these critical questions that help us start to reframe a policy, an event, procedure, like whatever it might be, that helps us to start to see some of these underlying political dynamics. And that reminded me of there's often two questions that I found myself coming back to, particularly in grad school or as I was trying to build my analytic,
Mhm.
but particularly around power structures. And I often find myself asking to what end and to whom does this serve?
Mm.
As ways of starting to unearth, well, what's happening under the surface? Or we might see this as being an apolitical decision or whatever it might be, but there is always something going on underneath. And as you were talking about shifting this perspective on the Americas, global South, global North, it reminded me of another kind of mini Matrix moment. And I know, Nicole, this will resonate with you because you have experienced the impacts of this as someone who asks me to edit their work and provide feedback. When I was in my master's, down in Costa Rica, international program, folks from all over the world, and there was a young woman named Ellie, who is just one of my favorite people in the world. She was visiting. She was on leave from undergrad and just came down to spend a semester with us and sat in on some classes and just a incredible person. She's from Ecuador, 21 years old. But anytime in conversation from a professor, we had a lot of like visiting faculty that were working professionals as well as academics. But anytime someone would use the phrase the Americas or American as a standalone concept, she would always say, which America?
Mm.
Because folks were often talking about folks from the United States. And she said,
Yeah.
oh, okay, US American. So she said, I'm from Ecuador. I am also American. I am South
Mhm.
American. We are currently in the Americas, Central America. And that linguistic shift required folks to one be more intentional in their language but also recognize that like we have these concepts but we have a hierarchy so that when you use the shorthand America or American, you are referring to folks from 50 particular states. And I mentioned, Nicole, that you've experienced this because in a lot of your writing I would add US
Yeah.
American.
No, you definitely paid that forward because now I pay that forward to myself. I try to catch myself, but also to others. So thank you to Ellie for starting this chain because I'm marking up folks' work just like you mark up mine.
It's subtle, but it's an impactful way to
It really is.
make power visible.
For listeners, the other part of this that probably everyone saw was when Bad Bunny at the Super Bowl recently said, God bless America, and then proceeded to list every country in North, Central, Latin, South, and then also started the shifting geography of reason of not immediately saying the United States or Canada and presuming a standpoint or positionality if we start from North America and go down. Like, I think that is also demonstrative of that shifting of reason, but also to Ellie's point of how are we focusing, where are we putting our focus, and how are we being also accurate in the way that we talk about this, if that there is this group that we often lump together, but we also privilege certain perspectives. And there are all of these other countries that are part of what we would consider America. But
Mhm.
US American brain would say America just means the United States.
Even America first. Which America?
Mm, which America?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to dive into this question that you brought up at the top of the show about being apolitical. And I'm going to pose the question to you. Is that a thing? And then I think we'll also talk about the frustrations that you mentioned for folks who are coming to more of a political awareness, whether they
Mhm.
seemingly want to or not, as it is coming into contact or contrast with different spheres that folks deem as apolitical spaces. But I think before we dive into those questions, let's take a quick little break and we will be right back. All right, folks, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed that little taste of the work of friend of the pod, Matt Bogdanow. Nicole teased the question, so I want to jump right into it. Does apolitical exist?
Uh, no, Your
Bum,
Honor.
bum, bum.
No, it doesn't. Spoiler alert. This is not that kind of podcast. So if you disagree with that answer, I guess maybe you won't share that pod, or maybe you
Hmm.
do to be like, this is bullshit. Either way, share the pod. Um, no, being apolitical, I would say, and I think there's a lot of empirical examples, and I've cited many of them. I would put my money on that bet that there is no such thing as being apolitical. I think it sparks a larger conversation that often comes up in some of the spaces that I've been trained in, which is, can something be rational? Can something be neutral? For folks maybe who have spent a little time in some kind of lecture or seminar hall at any level of education, I think a good way that this plays out is often the pursuit of science or the pursuit of knowledge. In that case, maybe if you're in a physics class or chemistry or biology, is purely to know and to have reason and to think rationally is objective. And by objective, we mean it's without bias, it's without any kind of coloring or flavor or seasoning. And the opposite then of that would be the arts or philosophy, or spaces where we're allowed to color in and bring in meaning. That is bullshit. If politics is at its most basic form understanding the social, if it's understanding how we interact with communities, with one another, even a community of two, that is political. There's always a bias depending on where you come from. We talk about the perspective of experience on this podcast over and over again,
Hmm.
and that's absolutely right. Everything we do is colored by politics, by these negotiations that are happening, these undercurrents, who's allowed to be there, who's not. Again, it doesn't always have to be nefarious. I like to reference Foucault in this because it was something that took me a really long time to understand what they meant when they wrote power is a chain. It's a link of things, but it doesn't always have bad intention or good intention. Very oftentimes it does. But the choices that we make of where to engage, where not to engage are social choices. So I
Mhm.
think when we say something is not political, my question to that, if you believe that, would be, okay, explain to me, or can you tell me how this is not social? For some people, it feels less connotated and that it feels less weighted down by this assumption that, to go back to that example of, I hear politics and I assume everything means government. I hear politics and I assume that there's a social component. I would say that everything is politics because everything we do as humans is social.
And I wonder if some folks who don't see it that way yet, or don't want to see it that way, like I said early on, is that they're able to keep the social impact or influence
Mm,
at arm's length, or it doesn't impact their social. And so
yeah.
therefore it is apolitical to them, because again, it comes back to this idea of privilege and not having to be impacted or affected by the choices, like you said,
Hmm.
that we are making. I think an interesting additional question, which I don't know if exactly we will go into, but also I'm thinking about, if there is no apolitical, is there also a moderate in our current political landscape? Can moderation exist? And that comes to mind because one of the nightmare spaces that I keep occupying, for better or worse, are dating sites. And
Hmm.
an immediate red flag for me is if folks identify as apolitical or moderate, because I know that we are not going to be aligned. My
Hmm.
politics are fundamental to who I am as a person. You don't have to be as extreme in your stances, or I should say as radical in your stances as I
Hmm.
am on most things, but I need folks to understand that they are taking a stance, even if they
Yeah.
are thinking that they are not. And you brought up this idea of being neutral in situations. And so I want to bring in a quote that folks have likely heard from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, speaking about apartheid South Africa, as well as commenting on the world, who felt that it was maybe not their place to interfere in the politics of other countries. And his very famous quote, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor.
Mm.
Because to be neutral, to choose to ignore injustice, as he says, or violence, or to think that to not choose a side is to enable the oppressor because the oppressor
Yeah.
has power. To be neutral is to not recognize the power differential that is happening in that situation. And you mentioned choices. I'm going to talk about choices a little bit more.
Mm.
Claiming to be apolitical or to not recognize that the choices we make are enabling power structures is a privilege to do that
Yeah.
because we are not impacted by it. We talked a little bit about this last week in the Millennial Angst episode, where folks chose not to continue shopping at Target
Mhm.
because they recognized doing so would be a political act of saying, it is more important to me to have my easy access to the things that make me happy and comfortable. And I'm okay that that is throwing the queer community under the bus in order to do that. Similarly, we talked about this way back in episode 1 of season 1 when it comes to folks who are choosing to continue engaging with the Harry Potter franchise
Mm.
because the violence that is now directly related to that franchise, the financial investment of
Financial.
J.K. Rowling into campaigns of hate and campaigns
Mhm.
of trans erasure, folks choosing to interact with that franchise are making choices that are enabling violence and oppression, but they can convince themselves that that is an apolitical engagement because it's not within their social realm of impact.
Mhm.
And there are times where we don't always know if the CEO of whatever company is using the money that eventually gets to them um, to fund Trump, to give to Elon Musk, whatever it might be. But it's what do we do once we start learning those things?
Yeah.
And for a lot of folks, they want to keep their heads in the sand because if we don't know it, we don't have to feel bad about it. And that in itself is a political choice.
I think I want to go back to that point and also maybe offer a few different perspectives of observation because I don't want to categorize too broadly that someone who says I'm not interested in politics or I don't see this as political as not having care or empathy about things. So I want to return to that, but I do appreciate before that what you've now said about this idea that choices to not engage do allow an endorsement or a sort of passive complicity in systems. It makes me think about I spent a lot of years part of and then working for the YMCA Youth in Government program, which shout out to YAG or YIG, wherever you are in the States. Sometimes it's called one or the other. Phenomenal program for high school students, where the primary goal is to teach civic education and to teach people in high school how to engage in civil forms of government. Really fun, really fun. I've shit on the debate community before, as much as I loved it. I think YAG is the better of the angels. But we would often problematize one of the things that does happen in a political category, which is the abstention. So when you're voting yes or no, or you abstain, or I think if you're not in politics, sometimes people say, I'm Switzerland, right? Which just
Mm,
assumes this neutrality because
don't even
it's
get me
framed
started on Switzerland.
that if you don't engage, like you're saying, that somehow you are not bearing the responsibility, the accountability of the consequences of how it goes either way. And we teach students in that sense that no, actually what you're doing is you are swaying the vote because what you're not doing is you're not actively voting yes for or no against something.
Right.
It will pass or fail either way. And there is political motivation on one side for it to pass and on the other for it not to pass, and so you actually will endorse those outcomes even though you're not participating. A place that maybe doesn't feel as political or maybe feels politically situated because it's in the past, which is World War II. The United States for a long time, I recently rewatched Darkest Hour with Gary Oldman. Love that
Mm.
film. It's really great. The United States for a long time did not intervene in the Second World War. And was it because uh, we were neutral as we claimed? No, we knew what was going on in Nazi Germany. There was requests from the then later on Allied powers for us to get involved, and we maintained, oh well, we're not really here. Like you can kind of actively do your own fight over there. We're not here to get involved. Like, we support you, but we're not going to intervene because it's not our place to intervene. And what fucking happened? I mean, how many millions of Jews and other folks in Europe died because of that decision? So the consequence, whether the US sent people in or not, might have been at the time we said we're not actively engaging because it's not our place. But the material consequences of that supposed neutrality at the time still impacted millions of people.
And even though the government may not have been directly intervening or getting involved, US American businesses sure were and
Yeah.
were profiteering on both sides. And so that outward neutrality, what of that was also the influence of our robber barons and Ford and all sorts of folks encouraging non intervention in order to profit off both sides of a foreign war.
Yeah. And I think so then my other point of people saying I'm not interested in politics or I'm not doing politics. There are a series of just scrumptious memes, again, call back to last week, and other reels from clips where it's like, oh, you don't do politics. Because there's a lot of people who say, oh, I don't do politics.
Mm.
And it's like, well, politics is going to do you, babe. Like, whether or not you do politics, it is still going to happen. And I want to move us towards the conversation that we've been thinking about, which is who is privileged by not exercising that political consciousness in that sense. But I do, as I said earlier, want to also say another thing that I hear from people, and I think it's a really sticky thing to talk about. People saying, oh, I don't really want to talk about politics right now because everything seems saturated with politics in a way that I've never seen. And on one hand, I'm like, okay, well, the fact that you've never seen it, we should be talking about that probably. But
Yeah.
the other part of it is I do think people are exhausted. I think we talked about this last week. I have empathy for people saying, like, this is everywhere and it fucking sucks. And like, I want to switch off my brain, or how do I cope with this? Because I feel maybe like I am being complicit by just not actively talking about my politics somewhere or not signaling it, especially online when I've said this earlier, all of this political undercurrent has been happening whether people have noticed or not. But because of the prevalence of social media and that folks are just kind of perpetually online, means that it's not new. It's just, I think it was Will Smith said this 15 years ago or something, like racial violence towards Black people isn't new. It's just being filmed.
Mm.
And I think it's the kind of same thing where it's like, you might not have noticed it for degrees of privilege that we should absolutely be talking about, but it's also visible in different ways that forces people to engage with it. And I can see how that both is eye-opening and people should be taking that more seriously, to be thinking about how you get out of this bubble of your political privilege, but also that incessant and constant news cycle and constant opening up. You see people's politics on display everywhere now. I also can understand how that can be really overwhelming for folks. And sometimes I genuinely just wanted to like come online and see memes. And now I'm confronted with another case in point. Last week we talked about this. I woke up on Saturday and just thought that it was going to be a fun Saturday, going to do some stuff with the fam while I was out of town. And yeah, it really fucking sucks to wake up and then think about shit, like we're bombing another country and how many people just died and how many girls at that school just fucking died. Like, that is political. But I also know that like anyone should be troubled by that if you're thinking
Mhm.
critically about that.
Yeah, I think that to your point, it is that we have less control over how we consume
Mm-hmm.
really devastating news. Where growing up for you and I, you knew that if you turned on the news at 9:30 or 10, that you were likely not going to see things that were nice until the last 5 minutes when there was like a human interest story or, a surfing squirrel at the county fair. But that
Mm.
a lot of it, you were going to see international news, you were going to see local things that were troubling, and you could prepare your brain for it. It was like the quote that I shared from one of my participants who, when the George Floyd cell phone footage came out, she said, our brains are not built to watch somebody die like that. And that scrolling Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, whatever it is, like a lot
Yeah.
of times folks aren't doing content warnings. It just shows up. Sometimes there isn't sufficient text and you just start watching a video and you don't know the direction that it's going to go. And before you even have the moment to swipe away, you see someone dying by police violence or a
Mm-hmm.
car running through a crowd. I think there is area to push back on whether racialized violence is being documented more. I think it's being documented differently. Lynchings were a Sunday afternoon in the park for white folks. They used to gather
Yeah.
to watch it
We
and
used to
take
send each
photos
other
in front of it.
postcards.
Yes. So it's documented differently. But even in that example, that is something that folks knew when it was going to happen and they chose to like go attend it.
That's true.
And
And for better or for worse, and I would say for worse, we have all recently seen political executions that
yes,
my algorithm might have only been cats, but I saw that. I saw those, like that was force fed to us in a way that I
yeah,
did not self select in that, unless you count me opening up my algorithm means, oh, now you get to fucking watch people get murdered.
right. And to take it back to your comment on my comment, which we can do at this segment
We
of
could
the
do that.
show, what I was starting to allude to, and you were, I think, going to push back a little bit or offer some different framing. And so I'm going to preemptively
Oh.
meet you in the middle of that pushback and we'll see where we go. Um, it, yeah, I do have a sort of instinctual, or one of my therapists would encourage me to say a habitual response, because it's a habit that I've developed and I can develop different habits where there is a level of judgment that
Mm.
if I see someone identifying as apolitical, as moderate, that I do read things into it. And I think to your point, yes, some folks may mean that they disengage from the political landscape, meaning governance. They're not that interested in like what's happening in Congress, or they're disconnected from presidential politics, those kinds of things. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't care about people at their community level. And I think that
Sure.
that is true. But I think we have also got to a point in our culture and in our society where even if that's what it means to you, if you label yourself in an outward facing platform as apolitical, you are communicating that you are not a safe person for a lot of folks, that folks of marginalized identities, folks of vulnerable situations, may not be safe with you because you are wearing this label outwardly, despite how it
Mm-hmm.
might mean to you. And a lot of times, like, if I could go in and critique people's dating sites profiles, a lot of it is like dictating other people's behaviors instead of really owning their own. Folks may not be super aware of what they're communicating or the complicated nature of how our labels are communicative, but that is how I interpret it.
I would co-sign on that. Your question earlier of can someone be moderate, or, what does moderate mean in this kind of climate? Well, I don't like binaries. That's hard because we do talk like the badness of binaries in our work. But no, I think I would, the way that I would think about that is there another thing I've seen on social media, but I love it. And you know me, I love using cultural artifacts to
Mm,
explain tapestries of difficult topic, because I think they do it better than I can as like a precocious academic. But somebody says, "Oh, I'm not interested in politics." And so then to this point of that shows me how I can trust you or not trust you means, "Oh, you're not into politics? Oh, okay. So you're not a woman, and you're not a
mm,
black person, and you're not a queer person. And oh, that means you're not a disabled person. You don't live in a particular class or caste system." And so to say that I'm not interested or I'm going to be disengaged, on one hand, yeah, not everyone needs to watch C-SPAN. I live in DC, and like most of the time you never see politics here, and I
mm,
work 2 blocks from the White House. You don't have to constantly have the TV on, but it also signals, if you're not interested, that this question of privilege, or this perspective of privilege, to me demonstrates that you are in a category, or you consider yourself to be in a category where you fundamentally don't have to take for granted or be active in the engagement of the protection of your rights or the rights of your community or the people around you, and that you exist in a vacuum where you don't have to think about politics. And yeah, that's probably accurate because they're not touching you in a way, because you have
mm,
systems of privilege protecting you. You exist within a particular framework, usually white folks. I would not say not exclusive to white men, but categories of whiteness typically in power and access to money and access to wealth in a way that you're not thinking about these things because you're not forced to. And yeah, so like must be nice is I guess what I could say, because yeah, it very much kind of tells you immediately the type of person you're engaging with.
You made an interesting comment about the 4 years under Biden, or at least the first like 2 years before an election cycle kicked back off. And that was also we were coming out of the pandemic, or we're still in it, but opening up in new ways. There was this quote unquote return to normalcy. And I think there
Hmm.
was some sigh of relief. We were exhausted in Trump 1, both because of what was happening in that administration, but as well as compounding with a pandemic. And that is not a time period where I would have been critical of folks needing to check out or needing to find a new kind of balance, because we had all been at this heightened awareness of the political nature of our lives. And that was often through crisis. The thinking about the deportations and the closing off of the United States to Islamic nations and Islamic folks. First act of the Trump 1, COVID, George Floyd, we were in constant crisis. And it makes me reflect back on my time with Occupy Wall Street, which I talked about this season, how these things happened under Obama. I think many of the cities that saw occupations mirroring what we created in New York City at Wall Street, that was popping up in cities across the United States, and many of them in blue cities in blue states. And the violent hand of the state that came to crush those moments of resistance were from Democratic mayors and Democratic governors under a Democratic president. I wouldn't say I lost a lot of friends during that, but it made it difficult for me to relate to folks, not because they were different, but because I was different. My worldview had changed so fundamentally. There was a period where I went very, very, very far to the left. Still very much identify as a radical and an anarchist when it comes to my politics, but it made it difficult for me to relate to people that I cared deeply about, because I came back to a question that often haunts me of, why don't you care? Or how can I make you care? And there was that privilege of disconnection. And there was a lot of folks were still wrapped up in the hope of Obama, and that we're under a Democratic president. We don't have Bush anymore. Things are better. And so I'm going to check out because I am not impacted in the same way. And that disconnection and that willful check outedness, just
Hmm.
coin that term, is something that I have very little empathy for. And I am not a diplomat. That's not one of my strengths. That's why I have a handful of folks, including my current supervisor, who read the first draft of my strongly worded emails, help me craft it more diplomatically, and then I send it. That's often not how I see my role, for better
Sure.
or worse. But it is something that I have a lot of difficulty connecting with and trying to remain connected to the empathy and the care that I have for people that I care about.
I think that's valid. Yeah, I don't know if I don't think I'm a diplomat. I think I can play the role of diplomat. And that because I did study political science for a long time, I do
And
think that
debate.
I'm good and debate anything government. Look, there was a time when I thought I would come to DC and maybe do the politics thing. What I learned is I can do it. I don't like it.
Mm.
But I mean, evident on today's podcast, what I do feel confident in is I think that if I was to thinking about this as like a D&D game, even though I don't play D&D, just haven't learned, not opposed to it. Don't want to isolate any listeners.
Don't come
Is I
for us,
guess like
nerds.
don't come yeah, nerds. Is as a fellow nerd, I would say like I do think I'm a professor. Like I love to like give a little lecture about things, which I think can come off as condescending. And so I guess to this point of sort of checking out or the spaces that we go to check out, there'd be two comments on that. One is I think in political struggle, whether you are used to it or whether you're just joining for the first time, I think generally folks would agree rest is as important as fighting. Like you need to
Mhm.
refuel in order to like get back out there. And also the lane that you choose to participate It does not have to be the same as your neighbor. I fucking hate it when I engage with people that are colleagues and friends or people that claim to be friends who love to tell me that I'm doing something the wrong way because I'm not doing it this way or I'm not doing that way. And sometimes, like the US American thing, that is a good check. Other
Mm,
times, I think it is a all or nothing kind of mentality. I talked about binaries earlier. I don't like them. Only Sith steal and absolutes.
mm.
I'm not telling everybody, or I don't want to be the person that tells this is how you have to fight the fight.
Is that not an absolute,
It isn't. Yeah, I mean,
right?
it is. It is, but it's such a great quote. Like,
Yeah. All right, we'll dive
because
in. We'll
also
do a nerd
from a
episode at some point. We'll dive into that one.
nerd, I'm not telling you how to fight the fight because there's multiple lanes that we should all be in. But at the same time, like, we all deserve a bit of rest as well. Though, what I think I disagree with and where I'm aligned with you is that when people go into spaces and assume that they are apolitical, or they get really angry when something that they perceive to be as apolitical suddenly has a political flair or flash. And I think this happens a lot in popular culture. I also think that it happens with such frequency that, it just shows how like fickle memory is in
Mhm.
sports, because not only is there the classic just shut up and dribble, which is very derogatory and has often been positioned towards Black athletes of you shouldn't have any kind of stake other than we're paying you to play. So you
Right.
should be on performance, which has a whole history of other layers that we won't get into. But I think recently, even with what happened at the Olympics and the US men's hockey team, it's really interesting to me how people online were talking about how frustrated they were that suddenly what happened with the men's hockey team became political, which to me is really interesting because I would think that the first layer that we would consider is the Olympics itself as an organized event, as a committee, as a worldwide phenomenon is inherently political in its nature. The
And
reason why it was
contrived
created
nationalism.
was politics. Politics perhaps in the best intent, but like this the spectacle of it is a political organized event. And we celebrate certain moments in time when it's the right kind of politics. People love to signal back to sports being triumphant.
Mm.
Again, I don't always want to make it a binary between us and Nazi Germany, but the moment that the black track athletes won over Hitler in the Olympics in Germany is this triumphant moment because that's kind of the right kind of politics. But
Mhm.
then the reaction to the men's hockey team, and the way that they engage with Trump and what's his face, the fucking FBI guy going into the locker room,
Cash Patel.
Cash Patel. I don't know. When that happens, then suddenly it's, oh, I can't be proud anymore. Now I've got to think about politics on top of this sport. And I suppose if the Olympics is where you go for some rest and R, I feel that because when I watch figure skating or those jumps or curling, we know your favorite, Dr. Brett,
Hmm.
like it brings joy. It's supposed to. That's part of the politics. But to assume that it was neutral to begin with, I think that's where I would be critical of the folks. And then to bring it back to when people are talking to me about, oh my gosh, why is everything political? I think the reason is it's like because it always has been. And
Yeah.
I would I would love to engage more in the conversation with people of like, how do we shift those geographies of reason that we've been taught to assume the political neutrality of things, that everything is not, that we only think about politics as it relates to maybe what we see when we go to the voting box or when we see a political figure who's been elected or appointed. How do we shift that geography in our own brains to assume politics and everything? And then how do we build that consciousness amongst one another? And also then how do we build in rest in that? Because I do empathize with the fact that that is a really heady and difficult project. But I take issue and I agree with you that if somebody says, I don't do this, it's going to be done to someone else. And looking at something, especially sports or popular culture or these quote unquote non traditional funnels of politics, is also a product politically to tell you that those shouldn't be avenues of politics. And they most certainly are. And those are really fucking powerful lanes that people can engage in that are intentionally obfuscated.
Hmm.
So, as we end, I guess the last thing I would say, Brett, and I'm happy to give you the last word, would be a really easy way to do this, putting on my professor hat, would be people love to say, do your research, or you're only looking at a particular source or something. I think when it comes to shifting the geography of reason, particularly right now and what's going on in the world, the first thing I would say is if you feel like, oh man, this is becoming political, or I'm thinking about this a different way, is to ask that question of politics versus social. And would also be to engage in looking at sources that are actively outside of your perspective of place. And specifically, I'm talking about what's going on right now with Iran and what's going on in the United States. It is easy, even as a flaming lib, as I'm sure people love to call me and my family, to say, oh, Nicole's only going to go and get access to information from CNN or NPR because we know she's not a Republican, so she's not going to look at Fox News. So
Mm.
she's going to look over here. I think a great check on the politics of where you are situated is to look at a source that is not from your own country, that is not from your region. And in this particular case, I would say before you even look at the news in the United States of what's going on right now, and I'm talking specifically about Iran, I would highly encourage folks to look at a very taboo media that does excellent journalism, which is Al Jazeera, which we don't often look at. I would say go look at another state media source. And that doesn't have to be your Bible, that doesn't have to be your doctrine, but shift that geography of reason to a different place. And if you don't know where to start with the place that you're being told is the enemy, because I think that'll give you at least some insight into how they're thinking about the politics or how they're framing that. And then from there, make decisions, engage, do all this stuff. This isn't a lesson in how to engage like with media literacy, but I do think it's really important to say if I don't feel the impacts of something, I assume it's political or apolitical in that sense. Maybe if someone is telling me it's political for them, I should at least try to look at it through their perspective. I should shift my own internal geography of reason to theirs for just a minute.
I think the example that you brought up of and the conversation around the US men's hockey team moment is such an illustrative example of the political and the social, where
Mm,
folks wanting to say this wasn't inherently political. The president called to congratulate them. We don't need to blow it out of proportion. Debatable. The moment where it took a turn for me, where it becomes more about social and it becomes about signaling that these young men are not safe, is when they all laughed at the idea that the women's team, who also won gold,
hmm
would it's a burden to have to invite them as well. We just want a bunch of dudes sitting around a table eating yesterday's McDonald's. Like that's their reward for throwing their teammates under the bus who shared in this victory. And they've signaled to not only their teammates on the women's team, but also the women in their lives that they are not valued. And that
Yeah.
is political. And yeah, I will echo your point of we should be consuming outside of our little bubbles. And I appreciate your examples because there are ways to do that that are not subjecting ourselves to things like Fox News, where there is very little to be gained from that source. And we will continue to be a delightfully biased news source here on the pod. So please stay tuned as we come back from this little break with our signature closing segment, More Comment Than a Question.
All right. And we are back, folks, for more of a comment than a question. This week, my more of a comment than a question, and no, I will not be taking follow ups. It's pretty simple. If you're watching the news this week, fuck you, Lindsey Graham, and fuck you, Stephen Miller. That is all.
I more comment than a question. I want to leave folks with something a little bit lighter, something nice. I was scrolling my Instagram as I love to do, and a publishing company that I really love is called Tor, Tor. We'll link them in the show notes. We publish a lot of fantasy, sci-fi, utopias, and predominantly, though not exclusively, authors of color, women of color, and queer folks. And just fantastic. It's one of the highlights every year when I go to San Diego Comic-Con to see their panels, meet their authors. Last season on the pod, I talked quite a bit about Olivia Blake and Girl Dinner, published by Tor. But I saw that there are a couple different books coming up both this year and next year from an author named J.T. Clune, who is a queer author who is positioning himself as the anti J.K. Rowling and is trying to
Oh,
uplift queer stories, trans stories, built community, built family. And I've read probably 10 or so books of his at this point. They're lovely. They make me cry in the best ways. And so I'm just very excited that he will have new books coming out. I didn't get to see him at Comic-Con this last year, so I'm hoping he'll be back. So I will link a bunch of his books. And if you're looking for nice stories that are also navigating complicated social dynamics, political dynamics, it'll make you feel, it'll make you think, and it's beautiful. So that's what I want to leave you all with.
Thank you, Dr. Brett. I'm not allowed to comment on your comment, so a separate thing as we close out. I appreciate that we're ending a little bit on some levity. I just also wanted to put on folks' radar because it might not be part of your algorithm, but if you'll indulge me, Dr. Brett, what's recently happened for the trans community in Kansas and some of the other legislation that's moving through the United States right now. We've talked a lot about J.K. Rowling and certainly the wave of anti-trans work and funding and capital that's flowing in the UK predominantly, where she resides. But networks globally, look out for one another, but keep an eye out and check in with your folks because there are some really nefarious pieces of legislation that are actively targeting the trans community. Not to mention some of the stuff that's coming up that'll probably make more national news at the Supreme Court. But that is a community that we should absolutely be shifting the geography of reason on if we're not already, and actively providing a spotlight there because there's some just pretty nasty stuff happening in the States. So just wanted to echo Dr. Brett in that we should be uplifting spaces that are actively trying to work against those communities and spaces of harm. But this is a place to be critically informed. And if you're not aware, then just type in on Google Kansas legislation trans. With that, we talked a little bit about rest, Dr. Brett, this week on the pod. And it's kind of that time. It's spring break. So we're here for you for a longer season 2 than a season 1. And we've got some fun things coming up that we want to tease on the podcast, but we don't want to do them quite yet. So in a unprecedented move, Dr. Brett and I are also going on spring break with all of the folks at our respective colleges, all the youths in the world right now. So we're going to take a little break from the pod very briefly, back to regular scheduled programming, but we're going to take a week off next week. So we hope that you enjoy the rest. And if you haven't, check out that back catalog of season 1 and early episodes of season 2. And you know the deal. If you like them, and we know you do, please share that pod. But we will be back later this month.
See y'all soon. Doc to Doc is co-hosted, written, produced, and edited by us, Dr. Brett S. Goldberg and Dr. Nicole K. Mayberry. Our original music was written and performed by Matt Bogdanow, and our original artwork was illustrated by Andre Gonzalez. Doc to Doc is an independent podcast and a conversation across place, perspective, and friendship. We record Doc to Doc between Washington, D.C. and Orange County, California. In Washington, D.C., we record on the ancestral lands of the Nacotchtank Anacostans, also known as the Anacostan or Nacotchtank peoples, and near the lands of the Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples. In Orange County, we record on the traditional and unceded lands and waters of the Hashiman and Tongva tribal nations.